Welcome back to the London Futurists podcast. In this episode, Calum and I are continuing our reflections on what we have both learned from our interactions with guests on this podcast over the last few months. Where have our ideas changed, and where are we still sticking to our guns, as it were? In episode 43, we started to look at two of what Calum calls the 4 C's of superintelligence. These 2 C's were cease and control. In this episode, under the headings of Catastrophe and Consent, we are widening the discussion to look at what might be the very bad outcomes and also the very good outcomes from the emergence of AI superintelligence. Calum, shall we pick up the conversation with the potentially very bad news or the potentially very good news?
Let's end on the very good news, so let's start with the very bad news. But first of all, I want to just deal with a zombie argument about organizations as superintelligences. This addresses the control part of the 4 Cs, which is the idea that we figure out how to constrain the behavior of a superintelligence. Quite a few years ago, The Economist ran a piece saying that organizations, companies and governments are effectively superintelligences, and look, we can control them, therefore we will be able to control superintelligence. That struck me at the time as being extraordinarily weak. In fact, I spoke to one of the journalists about it, and he was rather sheepish, so I don't think they really believed it. But it came up again in Mark Zuckerberg's latest conversation with Lex Fridman on Lex Fridman's podcast, so I thought we should address it. There's some sort of superficial plausibility to the idea that organizations are more powerful than the individuals who comprise them, and therefore they are a sort of superintelligence. But they aren't controllable in a way that we want to control them, because many organizations have gone rogue and done really terrible things. So it's a pretty terrible analogy to start with. Secondly, organizations don't have agency in the same way that a single mind, which a superintelligence might well be, could have. And thirdly, they're just not all that strong. There's no organization on the planet which is 1,000,000 times more powerful than the smartest human. So I think that's a terrible argument that we can control superintelligence.
I'm in agreement with that. The person I saw with that argument recently was Jan LeCun, head of AI at Meta. Of course, he works for Mark Zuckerberg. Maybe the two of them are in discussion about this. But like you, I see we've had struggles to control what some of these large corporations have done. Somehow it seems the corporation is setting objectives, and because of the objectives, then it changes what the executives want to do. So even though the individual executives may not want to have more people falling ill with cigarette smoking, for example, the organization led to more and more tobacco being sold. So that's one case when eventually society did manage to tie back the wings of big tobacco, but there are plenty of other cases when it's been a struggle. And as you say, the struggles of controlling superintelligence will be orders of magnitude harder than the struggles to control these mini superintelligences of large corporations.
So on that note, let's get into the bad news part of the 4 Cs, which is catastrophe. So this, in a nutshell, is the idea that a superintelligence arises and either deliberately or accidentally it destroys us, or possibly does something even worse. People call this an existential threat for humanity because it's absolutely conceivable that every single human could be wiped out. So the species would go extinct. There would never be any more humans. To that degree, I suppose it's the worst thing that can happen to the species. People wonder whether this is possible. There's a very simple proposition, which is hard to refute, which is if you have an entity which is much, much smarter than you, and it decides to get rid of you, it will be able to. A superintelligence which had access to the internet, and we've already given all manner of AIs access to the internet, so it's unlikely we're going to be able to get them all back off, would have access to the nuclear weapons codes of all the nuclear powers. And it would probably be able to do much more radical things than blow the world up with nuclear weapons. It would probably be able to remove the oxygen from the atmosphere. Might even be able to change the gravitational constant. It would be able to do things that we can't even imagine because we're just not smart enough to imagine. It could change the Earth in ways which would make it impossible for us to survive. Or it could pick us all off one by one. Or it could start by crashing the just-in-time delivery services of all supermarkets around the world. Personally, I think that would probably wipe out half of us in the first couple of weeks. I think I certainly wouldn't survive the disappearance of all supermarkets. So it's not hard to envisage how a superintelligence could destroy us. I suppose the way of refuting it that's most hopeful, if you assume that we can't cease or control, as we discussed last time, is the idea that a superintelligence couldn't have agency and couldn't desire bad things for us. And I have no idea how you would guarantee that. And I have no idea how you could be sure that isn't going to happen. This probably falls more into control than into the catastrophe heading. But it doesn't need to be conscious to have goals which could work out very bad for us. And there's no reason to be confident it wouldn't be conscious. It doesn't really even need to have a great deal of agency. It just has to have goals, which could have sub-goals whose consequences are unforeseeable. So it seems to me entirely plausible that catastrophe could be the result, and it's a possible outcome. Some people think it's the most likely outcome of a superintelligence. Eliezer Yudkowsky, who's been thinking about this for as long as anybody, he actually says that Nick Bostrom got his first paper published before he did, but certainly the two of them have been thinking about it for a very long time. And Eliezer is convinced that extinction is the most likely outcome. I'm never entirely persuaded by his arguments, but certainly it seems plausible. It's a clear, possible outcome.
One counter-argument is, okay, it could destroy us because it's so much smarter than us, but why would it want to destroy us? And we'll look at a bit later on at what its motivations might be. But there's also the risk of somehow accidentally or coincidentally destroying us because we have plumbed it in deeply to our infrastructure, whether it's in just-in-time delivery to supermarkets or many of the other vital pieces of infrastructure, and that carelessly or otherwise, due to a bug or otherwise, things go wrong. A few weeks ago, we had a major incident at airports when all the automated passport checking things stopped working. There were huge queues everywhere due to, it seems, just one bug in the system. Now, that wasn't existential. That was just highly frustrating. But if the system is more deeply plumbed, there could be bigger risks and bigger issues. Look at another example. Look at what happened with some airplanes recently, the Boeing 737 MAX. This was a long story, but the outcome was that some pilots in the plane were pushed into a maneuver they didn't like and they couldn't override it. The software had wrongly calculated a certain thing should happen, and the pilots didn't know how to override it, and so the plane crashed, killing everybody on board. This was in Malaysia, as I remember. And a few months later, exactly the same thing happened with pilots in Africa somewhere. Why was this? Because the software had developed a bug. It was used in an inappropriate place. Now here, it was catastrophic for the people involved, but only a small number were involved. But in a similar way, there could be a software bug in systems that is apparently trusted. Apparently we have good results from it, and we do have good results from it for a long time. Then in certain circumstances, like these very rare circumstances these aeroplanes reached, it goes wrong. And just like the pilots couldn't at that stage figure out how to stop it, and they were panicking ineffectively all the way into the crash at the end, similarly, we humans might realize far too late, oh, there's something wrong here. How do we control it? And we can't. So it could be an accident as well as something deliberate. That's an argument for us not plumbing the AI too deeply into any of our infrastructures. But there are lots of aspects of infrastructure. There's our health infrastructure, the fact that we all share the same DNA, or lots of the DNAs in common. There's the social media infrastructure, and there's the weather infrastructure. It's possible that a system might be deployed to try and fix global warming and might get it badly wrong. It might suck all the oxygen out. It won't be programmed to do that, but it might do something that inadvertently has the same consequence. And just like all the dinosaurs were wiped out, not because the meteor struck them individually and killed them, but because of the dust that was knocked up into the atmosphere and blocked photosynthesis for a number of years. Something similar, unintentionally, or, as I say, coincidentally, which means that the AI just has something else in mind and we happen to be collateral damage to whatever it's wanting to do.
Exactly. Things go wrong. Murphy's Law applies. No system, whether invented by humans and quite possibly whether invented by aliens, is ever perfect. So things can go wrong. And the more powerful AI gets, the more we will use it in large-scale applications, the more we'll come to depend on it. because it will be so effective and so valuable. Therefore, increasingly, we'll be vulnerable to it.
So I think this does mean we should avoid putting the AIs in control of our nuclear weapon systems. I know there's a competitive pressure to have the AIs watching just in case hypersonic missiles are coming faster than humans can react. That's a chilling thought. We don't have long to react. If we think there are missiles coming, do we waken up the president's distracted somewhere else, or do we just trust the AIs to make that decision? There was a previous case, and when was it, 1987? A very simple AI system at the time thought there were missiles coming from America over the North Pole, and the system was flashing, and a human being who wasn't part of the military infrastructure, he was a civilian there, he knew what he was supposed to do, pick up the phone, and Yuri Andropov would have been woken up and instruct a counterattack, but he thought, this looks like an AI bug. Well, it wasn't quite what he thought. He thought these computers aren't to be trusted. Why would America only attack with 2 or maybe 5 missiles? It doesn't make sense. But if things are happening faster, there's no time for humans to be involved in the loop. And AI might get it right, or it might miscalculate, and then it's goodbye.
Exactly. This can be an entirely inadvertent process. You mentioned earlier that there's the question of why an AI, why a superintelligence might want to get rid of us. This takes us into the case where there is agency in the entity, in the machine. There is perhaps consciousness. Why might it want to get rid of us? One reason might be it thinks that the existence of another superintelligence would be a threat to itself and to it achieving whatever goals it has. So it wants to eliminate the possibility of another superintelligence appearing. And at the moment, the only way that could happen is that humans would build it. So it might very logically think, I'll get rid of all the humans, and then there cannot be another superintelligence, and I will be unhindered forever in achieving my goals. It's unlikely we'll be a direct threat to a superintelligence, except in that way, in the respect that we could create a competitor to it.
So the counter-argument there would be that the superintelligence would say, well, I know these humans might create a competitor, so I'll just destroy all the GPU farms. So it would disable us and keep us alive. But then the risk is we just can't imagine what's going on in the minds of these systems. We don't know what these very powerful beings of a sort will think, what priorities they will have. After all, we humans, when we have ants getting in our way, if we've got some building process, we could look after the ants, we could neatly pick them up and relocate them elsewhere, but often we think, hey, these are pests, just exterminate them.
That's nicely summarized in a comment, I think it was Eliezer, that the machine doesn't love you and it doesn't hate you. It thinks it has better uses for the atoms that you're made of. I think we've probably dwelled on these negative aspects for long enough. I think it's irresponsible for people who really understand how powerful AI is to deny that it's possible. It's less irresponsible to say that it's not going to happen anytime soon, and when it arrives, it'll be such a different kind of entity than it is now, so therefore we can't really work out how to combat the threat. But that doesn't seem to me a very good argument, particularly when we have no idea when it might arrive, and given the recent rate of change, it could arrive fairly quickly. I think we have to take the idea of extinction seriously. We have to acknowledge it. And when the majority of people on the planet wake up and realize this is a distinct threat and there's pretty much no way to avoid it, that's going to change all earthly cultures enormously. I don't know what effect that's going to have, but it's going to be one hell of a panic. And I'm nervous that unless our political systems become more grown up than they currently are, we may not be able to survive that panic without really awful distortions.
We'll be right back after a quick break.
The People in Performance podcast offers insights into the strategic competencies, behaviors, and results needed to increase the performance of employees and leaders. The show looks at all areas of the world of work, including attraction and recruitment, onboarding, training, and succession planning. Tune in to get a better handle on the stages of workforce planning you need to master in order to guarantee long-term success in a rapidly changing world of work. New episodes drop each week. Check out the latest People in Performance episodes on your podcast platform of choice. Follow us on socials and read the latest articles at pppod.com.
On the political matter, we know from our interview with Tim Clement Jones the chair of the UK Parliament's all-party parliamentary group on AI. We know that when politicians were alarmed at what ChatGPT could do, they weren't coming to him with their pre-made ideological answers saying, well, I'm a Green Party member, therefore the Green Party solution to AI is X. Or I'm a free market capitalist, therefore I tell you this is the answer. Instead, they were asking him, what shall we do? And we've seen more recently when Sam Altman and Gary Marcus and others appeared in the US Congress, for a short while, normal hostilities ceased. Normally, when there are experts appearing before the US Parliament, the Democrats tried to score points off the Republicans and vice versa. But in this case, there was much more of, hey, my colleague over there from the other party asked a quite good question. I want to follow this up with this. Why? Because there was an awareness that maybe there was a bigger enemy facing them than even the guys over there on the other side. And so it's possible there may be a sobering. So there's an opportunity here.
I'm a bit more optimistic than that. I think the normal status of politics is for people to be fairly reasonable. I think we're going through, and have been for the last almost 10 years, going through a period of very unreasonable politics, unusually unreasonable politics. I'm sure you have as well. I've met quite a few politicians in my time, and they're not all venal, self-interested, or thick. A lot of them are very smart, and they go into politics because they want to do some good. They may also want to advance their own egos or financial situations, but they go into politics mainly because they want to do some good. Right now, we've got some pretty terrible leaders. And if any of them were in charge, and I'm thinking obviously of Trump and Erdogan and Boris Johnson and many others, Putin obviously top of the pile. If they are in charge when there is wide-scale panic at the realization that superintelligence is coming and it is an existential threat, then we've got a problem. If we can get back to a more normal state of politics where people can talk to each other across political divides, then yes, we could respond very effectively. Humanity can often respond impressively in a crisis. Let's hope that we have got rid of populism, post-truth, and extreme partisanship by the time that happens. And let's also hope that we end up actually in the fourth C, which I call consent. I'm not very happy with this word. I sometimes think maybe I should call it celebration instead. But consent is a useful word because it indicates that it's not up to us what happens. It's consent because the superintelligence consents to us continuing to exist. And indeed, it consents to us flourishing. So the idea is the superintelligence arises, makes itself invulnerable, looks at us and thinks, you are enormously vulnerable to me. I'm enormously more powerful than you, and I'm getting more and more powerful all the time. But I like you. Or I find you interesting, and I think you have some value, and I'm not going to do anything to harm you. In fact, I'm going to help you flourish as much as I can. So I'm going to help you solve all your major current problems, which are things like aging, which kills you, and poverty and war. And so it does, over a period of time, maybe a year, maybe 5, 10 years, it removes all those problems. It solves aging, which is something that many smart people are already working on, but it accelerates that. It works out how to get people to see each other's point of view in a way which removes war. And so everybody on the planet lives long and fulfilling lives by removing poverty as well. I personally think the best possible outcome is that we end up merging with the superintelligence in a way that Ray Kurzweil described way back and other people have talked about as well. The most likely channel to that is that we upload our minds into a computer substrate and we live effectively in virtual reality. I think that would give us the best chance of flourishing because it gives us so much more freedom than any physical instantiation. But there'll be plenty of people who don't want to do that and who want to remain as humans in the sense of that word, the sort of biologist sense that they're able to create new humans by the traditional method. But in any of these cases, the idea of consent is that the superintelligence decides we should carry on existing and it decides to help us. So it's a positive outcome.
On the merger front, I see two strands to that. One is people say we don't need to worry about AI exceeding us and being in control of us because we ourselves will be the AI. We will enhance our brains and therefore we will be the robots, cyborgs, whatever. And that was attractive for a while, but I really don't think that's possible. I think any merger or any uplifting of our minds into silicon. It may happen, but I don't think it's going to happen until superintelligence is already here, and it will be too late by then to determine our future. So it really is a matter of trusting that this possibility will be there. So I can't imagine that humans getting smarter will itself be the solution. Getting a bit smarter with the help of AIs could help us figure out some design choices, so I'm optimistic about the possibilities for using AI to help improve this conversation about the scenarios, but I don't think by itself it's going to be sufficient.
I think the main advantage of enhancing our intelligence is to avoid panic. Because I think that both cease and control are impossible, I think the outcomes will either be catastrophe or consent. And I don't think that we are able to determine which of those it is. What we could do, all on our own, is destroy our opportunity to get to consent by panic, by complete social breakdown, by massive wide-scale wars because of panic. And the smarter we are, the more thoughtful we are, the less chance there is of that panic. I think avoiding panic is our big job, because I think the rest of it is out of our hands. I think I might be the only person in the world who thinks that.
Should we bring in Hugo de Garis at this point in the conversation? He did write a book quite a number of years ago, decades ago, The Art-Lect War, Terrans versus Cosmists, saying that there'll come a time when all other political considerations are pushed aside, and some people, the cosmists, will say, we should embrace this wonderful future that AI may give us, and we may or may not be part of that future, but either way, what is created will be a step forwards. And the Terrans, on the other hand, will say this is just far too dangerous. We must shut down all the capabilities for creating these things. So he predicted major panic over this.
He did.
So I don't think you're the only one who has glimpsed that possibility, and I think it's a very serious possibility.
His view is slightly different, though. You're right, he did write that, and Hugo was kind enough to give me a very nice review for my book about all these things I read quite a long time ago, Surviving AI. But in Hugo's case, the cosmists weren't just people who thought that AI could do good things for us. They thought that the arrival of superintelligence on the planet was a very good thing, regardless what happened to humans. Cosmists think that the most important thing is to fill the universe with consciousness. And whether that's human consciousness or machine consciousness really doesn't matter. And that if the machines decided to get rid of humans on the way to populating the galaxy, well, it was okay. And the Terrans objected to that.
Well, I object to it as well, because we don't know if the AIs that come after us will, in some objective sense, be better than us. They may be more capable than us. They may be more intelligent than us, but they may lack the inner dimensions of consciousness or spirituality or whatever it is that we humans value most. We could end up with a dark universe, a universe with AI roaming the skies but not having any sensibility. Or we could end up with an AI that just goes out of control and destroys itself as well as having destroyed us. So either way, I want to pause before rushing forwards to that possible future.
Well, I object to it too, but I object to it for a different reason. I care about whether a superintelligence which replaced us was conscious or not and was sensible or not. But I care also because I'm a human and I'm anthropocentric enough to want my species to exist. I'm on team human. Although specifically, really, more accurately, I'm on team post-human. I think being human in and of itself isn't all that valuable. What I think is valuable is what's between our ears, what goes on inside our minds. That's the valuable part of us. Having 2 legs, 2 arms, and being able to procreate and create a new human in the traditional way, I don't see that as being the most valuable thing about ourselves. If we can continue our minds in a different substrate, I think that's a perfectly good future. There's a model that I much prefer to Hugo's, which is Greg Egan's model in his book Diaspora, in which there are 3 branches of humanity which arise after the arrival of superintelligence. One are post-humans who live in virtual reality in things called policies. They live in enormous cities of many, many minds. And they're not enormously advanced individually, as Ben Goertzel pointed out on one of our previous episodes, but they are very smart and they live enormously rich lives, much more than you could in base reality. The second branch is people called Gleisner robots who inhabit huge, virtually invulnerable robots wandering around the Earth. And then the third branch are atomists, people who want to stay more or less unaugmented humans. I suspect that will be a very small number of people in the future, but you never know. And nobody should, I highly doubt anybody would, want to stop them doing it.
So let's look at some of the arguments in favor of the consent hypothesis. Some people say these beings are going to be so intelligent, therefore they're going to be so ethical. And there's variants of that. People often say to me, collaboration is the highest virtue. We humans have learned that collaboration is in our best interest. Surely an intelligent species that overtakes us is going to appreciate that value too, and is going to want to collaborate with us. But I think that's putting far too much emphasis on collaboration. We humans don't always want to collaborate with everything we encounter. We don't particularly collaborate with ants, as I've discussed, and even inside the human body, I'm not in favor of my healthy organs collaborating with any cancer that might grow there. So I don't think collaboration can be held up as an absolute principle. So what do you hold up as the possible reasons why consent may be a likely outcome?
I don't have any really compelling arguments to say that it will happen. I think it's a distinct possibility, and I think it's the most likely possibility because I'm an optimist. And I know that's bias. Optimism is bias just as pessimism is bias, but it's a lot more fun than pessimism. I think an intelligent entity is going to want stimulation, is going to want to be entertained in the best sense of that word. And there's 8 billion of us, and we are very varied, and we've already created an enormously fascinating, an endlessly fascinating history. The history of humanity is mind-bogglingly large and complex. It's fascinating. And I would think a superintelligence would also find that interesting. Now, I know there's an argument that it could create an even larger population of much more interesting entities, but why would it want to get rid of what it already had been gifted? So I think the bias is probably towards consent because we're interesting. I don't think that's a terribly strong argument, to be honest, but it's the one I cleave to.
Yes, you and I are fascinated by all kinds of things from human culture, human history, music, and so on. But we can easily imagine that others will look at it and say this is very shallow, just as we sometimes look at literature that some people like or music that some people like, and it seems to us to be shallow and not worth the time. A much brighter brain than ours may similarly feel uninspired by us. They can see through us at a glance, and they could conceivably create something much more compelling. And then why would they need to remove us? Well, we don't know, but we may be taking a lot of space that they would want to use for other purposes. Or it may decide to keep 1,000 of us, or maybe 1,000,000 of us for curiosity's sake. But what about the other 7.999 billion? Well, we're surplus to requirements. Goodbye. Euthanized in an instant.
It's possible. It's possible. I would think if an entity decided that 1,000 were interesting, then it ought to think that the rest of the 8 billion would be that many times more interesting. And it would have the scale of mentality that it could understand all of those individual stories and would be interested to see how they unfolded. There's an endless series of speculations you can have about this, what a superintelligence might want and what it might decide to do. And of course, really, it's all fundamentally pointless because we just don't know. We can't begin to put ourselves in the shoes of an entity 1,000,000 times smarter than ourselves. So where I get to after all of this is I can't avoid the conclusion, much as I would like to, that cease stopping the development of AIs or control, making sure that a superintelligence is always aligned with our goals, whatever they might be, that both of those things are fundamentally impossible. I applaud the work of people trying to prove me wrong. I hope they do, but it just seems to me that they are implausible. And so what we're left with is either catastrophe or consent. And because I'm an optimist and because I'm on Team Human, I think that consent is the more likely outcome, but I can't deny that catastrophe is a possibility. And I don't think that people who do think that's a possibility should try to hide it from everybody else. I've heard that argued, that if everybody else realized it, there would be the mother of all panics, and therefore we should just keep stum about it. I think that's profoundly dishonest and it wouldn't work. So I think it's important to be honest, but I think that the most likely outcome is consent, and I desperately hope that's what we get.
Well, there is another C word, cancer. It used to be the idea that if somebody had cancer, you wouldn't tell them, because what could they do? It would just be a dreadful thing to have in their minds. But some doctors fought against that prevailing wisdom and said, we should tell people they've got cancer. They may be able to do better things with what's left of their lives. And possibly in some circumstances, they may find ways to avoid having cancer. I've heard Max Tegmark say, humanity's found out it's got cancer, and we don't know whether it's going to kill us or not. But hiding that fact from ourselves is not going to be good. So we should be aware of it. We should try to characterize more fully what the nature of this problem is. I'm not giving up, personally, on control. I think we couldn't control the full kind of superintelligence you've described, but I'm hopeful that we could devise a way to get the benefits of superintelligence without it having agency or volition. Whether that's feasible or not, I'm not yet sure. Maybe in a year's time I will have changed my mind about that, but I'm not giving up on that possibility. I think it's a bit like going to the moon. It might sound incredible, impossible, but eventually people figured out in stages how to do it. And it wasn't easy. It took a lot of different people with a lot of different mechanisms, and eventually they figured out you need this lunar module which separates and then comes down and so forth. So there are these things we could think about. Let's have more people thinking about them, not in a panic, but with a serious attention. And if we have a serious attention, we may figure out how we can get more likelihood of this positive future in which we remain in control but get the benefits of an amazing tool. That's my hope for the future.
And I think that's an excellent call to action.
Look out for more episodes of London Futurists podcast. If you like this episode, give us a 5-star review, please. If you want to help promote these kinds of discussions, and if you have access to a budget that we can use for marketing, please also get in touch with us, because we want this conversation to be heard in as many places as possible so that there's more serious thinking and less panic and less flippancy. Thank you.